says I'm live now. Hello. Ugh, adjust my stool. My name is Jameis. I'm a programmer at WPL, and welcome to the second of two Maketastic programs. Today we're going to learn a little bit about blacksmithing. Last week we did 3D printing. This week, blacksmithing. Blacksmithing is a lot of fun. It's basically you get to heat up some metal and you get to smash it with a hammer. It isn't a whole lot more complicated than that. But there's a whole bunch of things to consider if you want to do blacksmithing yourself. It's surprisingly easy to get into. Not that I want to disparage those who do blacksmithing professionally or artistically. It's surprisingly easy to get into, but like it comes with a very big but. It's quite obvious how you could spend a lifetime mastering it. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about just doing blacksmithing at home. In this case, I'm at my house in my front driveway. I have a second camera that I'll use in a moment to look at some of the tools in my setup, and we'll do a little bit of blacksmithing. So first up, safety. There are 4 things that you need to consider for safety if you want to do blacksmithing yourself. First up, steel-toed shoes are pretty much mandatory. If you drop tools, if you drop heavy things, because blacksmithing is all about using heavy stuff, you want to not break your foot. So it's very important that you have, nice steel-toed shoes. Second thing you need if you're going to be blacksmithing is eye protection. I got these goggles on my forehead. They're nice and fogged up already. I'm going to take them off my forehead for a bit. Yeah, you only have one set of eyes, and when you blacksmith, it's entirely possible for little bits of debris to fly all over the place, and the last thing you want is to get some of that into your eyes. When you blacksmith, you're heating up steel, metal, and the fire gets really hot, and that actually helps to oxidize the metal very quick, and you get what's called scale on the outside. And this scale, when you're pounding your steel, has a tendency to fly off and goes all over the place. Yeah, that's number 2. Number 3, hearing. Some sort of hearing protection is definitely recommended. I have here earplugs that I can just stick in my ears. You can get the over-the-head earphone type things, headphone type things as well. It's just when you're banging on that metal sometimes, depending on your anvil setup, you can get quite a loud ring. It can be very, very loud. So you want to protect those ears as well too. And then finally, 4th thing that you want to have is water. And we'll see that in a moment when we walk around my setup. For obvious reasons, water can be used for all sorts of things, for dousing out fires, to plunging a burnt hand into. It's also used as a tool as well too. So on that note, now that you're all safe and ready to blacksmith, let's talk a little bit about tools. What I'm going to do, I got my second camera here. I'm going to switch over, so I'm going to mute this. There we go. Sorry about the feedback. There's the screen and screen setup. And here is my blacksmithing setup. So we're going to talk a little bit about tools. Probably the most important thing with blacksmithing is a hammer. You're heating up that metal and you got to smash it. I have here a nice heavy hammer. Usually blacksmithing hammers have a nice smooth face, just like that, you see there. And standard blacksmithing hammer is about 3 pounds. And that one says 3 pounds right on the bottom there. You can go a little bit heavier. You can go a little bit lighter depending upon the application that you're doing. But yeah, you need a hammer. Second thing you're going to need is an anvil. I have an anvil here. I'm lucky enough, I actually found an anvil on Kijiji and bought it. This is just an itty-bitty tiny one. Usually when you blacksmith and you have an actual real blacksmithing anvil,
they're going to weigh about 100 to 150 pounds. This little itty bitty guy, I think, is like 40 or 50 pounds. It's not terribly heavy at all, but it's got all the essential parts that an anvil needs. It has a nice big face up on top here. So the smooth surface where you do most of your work is called the face. It has a horn, so you can bend stuff over it, make rounded objects. And that even has a little table. This extra little flat spot here is called a table. You can use all the edges as well too. Back here is called a heel. And then these two holes, this is a Pritchell hole and this is a Hardy hole. The Hardy hole is used for adding on tools. So you can make or purchase tools that will fit into this square hole. Things like a fuller, where you can use, it's basically a chisel that fits in here so that you can cut metal into or chisel it or add lines and things like that. Pritchell hole is used for all sorts of things. You can use it to bend stuff or to make hold downs, all sorts of things. So yeah, anvil, number 2. Now you don't necessarily need to buy an anvil. I had, my first anvil was just a flat, thick sheet of metal that I put onto this log. And then after that, I actually had a piece of railway track I actually purchased. It was cut into an 18-inch section. And then I upgraded to this eventually. So yeah, anvil, number 2. Number 3, you're going to need a fire pot. And that's what's going here. This fire pot, I'm quite proud to admit, cost me all of $10 to put together. A fire pot is basically a place where you have your fire. With blacksmithing, it's probably about, I'd say, 3 major kinds of fuel that are used. Coal, gas, and then induction, which is an electric current that you put through here. But by far, probably the most popular is using fire, or a fire pot in this case. Fire, you can see right there, it's got a nice good ball of energy right in the middle. This is actually a brake drum. So this came off of a truck. I went to an auto shop and asked if they had any old brake drums that they had replaced, and they gave it to me for free. This angle steel I found at the side of the road. It was meant for recycling. The only thing I really purchased to make my fire pot was this hair dryer that I used to blow air into it to make the fire nice and hot. It cost me all of $4 at the dollar store. Not the dollar store, the Mennonite thrift store, MCC. And then on the bottom here, I bought that little bit of metal adapter and pipe to so I can connect a hose from the hair dryer all the way over to my fire pot. Now the reason why I have this hair dryer blowing in there is to get oxygen blowing into the fire to make it extra hot, nice and hot. Yeah, and then you just load it up with your coal and you manage your fire. So that's item number 3. Number 4, tongs. Now tongs are something that you use to help hold on to metal. All right, so this fire gets nice and hot. We stick our steel in here that we want to blacksmith, that we want to forge. And the whole thing can get nice and warm. Depending upon what steel you're using, how big it is, its dimensions, things like that, the whole thing may heat up, or sometimes you can get away with hanging onto the end if it's the case of something long and thin that heats up. You don't have to worry about it getting hot at both ends. So we're going to want to use tongs to hang on to things. So you can stick your piece of metal into your fire. You let it sit in there for a little bit to heat up, and then you use your tongs to grab your piece of metal, and you head on over to the anvil and smashy. All right, so that's item number 4. And then finally, item number 5, it's both a safety thing as well as a tool, water. So I got a nice great big bucket of water here. Water is used with what is called quenching. So you stick your metal in your fire pot, you heat it up, you do some work on it, but then say you want to move further back on your piece of metal, maybe you don't want the end to get deformed or damaged at all. What you can do then is quench your piece of metal, the end, in there to cool it, and then you still have the rest of it being fairly hot or warm, and with that, you can work with it. So yeah, so those were the 5 big things. We got a hammer, an anvil, fire pot, tongs, and water. Ugh. All right, I'm gonna head back. Now I'm gonna switch back to the other camera. So I'm gonna mute myself here.
There we go. So I gave you a very brief overview of safety equipment, tools. Next thing we want to talk about a little bit is metal, steel in this case. So that's what most blacksmithing is done with. So let me grab this. So blacksmithing is typically done with steel. Steel is iron with carbon added to it. So iron exists in nature in a lattice. So the individual atoms of a piece of iron are together in a little network, a little lattice, and it makes it fairly stiff and fairly sturdy, but not terribly strong. So for steel, what we do is we add carbon to it. Carbon atoms are smaller than the spaces in between the iron atoms, so they can kind of fit in there and make it denser and stronger, a lot more sturdy, rigid, and makes it a lot easier for us to use for high strength applications. So when you are blacksmithing, depending upon the carbon content in the steel will determine how hot you'll need to get your fire, your steel, and how easy it is to work with. Low carbon steel, so steel that has fewer carbon atoms in it, is more ideal when you're starting off, just because it's easier to work with. It's easier to heat up and easier to deform. It's not as strong as high carbon steel, and it doesn't have necessarily the same applications as high carbon steel, but it's a great way to start off making some really basic tools like pokers and things like that. Yeah, so there's all sorts of sources for low carbon steel. You can go off and buy it from a store. There's actually a place in town called Metal Supermarkets over in Kitchener, way down Victoria Street, that sells steel, and it's actually where I bought this stuff from. But also scrap steel is fantastic too. You can keep your eye out on for things on like in the recycling. Hold on, let me grab. I've got stuff everywhere. Among scrap steel that is popular, lawnmower blades. I recently switched out my lawnmower blade on my lawnmower because I was like 15 years old and got good and bent up. So this is a good steel to work with. It's nice and thin and easy for you to deform and shape. There's all sorts of other sources. Cars have various big pieces of steel that are good for blacksmithing. Things like leaf springs in trucks are fantastic for blacksmithing. Another popular item are railway spikes. They're very low carbon, low quality steel, but very deformable and easy to use. So yeah, that's what you're looking for when you're looking to work with steel. Blacksmithing is also one of those things, and this is the reason why I kind of really like doing it and kind of fell in love with it. It's one of those things that you can do for very little money. It's very easy to go the cheap or free or next to free route to put stuff together. They get a pretty decent setup that allows you to make all sorts of things, and you can spend the rest of your life learning how to make various things. So it's quite a bit of fun. Now I think I've talked about everything I want to talk about. Now, in terms of what you do to actually blacksmith, it's not all that difficult. You stick your steel in your fire, you heat it up, and then you smash it. I'm going to do a quick demonstration. I'm just going to get my camera lined up. Hold on. Got this fly that's been bugging me the whole time. It really likes me for whatever reason. Sorry, you can't see this. I'm just trying to line up the camera a little bit. So I'm going to describe what I'm going to do, because I'm going to be a little far away. You may not be able to hear me talk. So I have my fire pot my anvil set up, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this piece of steel and I'm going to stick it in the fire pot. I'm going to heat it up. When we heat up the steel, it starts to change color eventually. Once it gets the temperature, once it gets to working temperature, it will change color. So the steel will get a slight red hue to it when it's barely warm enough to work with, and it'll turn orange, then it'll turn yellow, then it actually will even turn white. If you heat it up a lot, it'll turn white and start to sparkle. You don't want that. It sparkles quite literally like a sparkler. That's just because it's so hot and the oxygen's reacting with it so quickly. It's just kind of burning away. You don't want to get it that hot if you can help it. And if it does, all you do is you take it out of your fire and you let it cool. It's not that hard. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick the steel into the fire. I'm going to let it get hot. Then I'm going to take it out. I'm going to smash it with my anvil a little bit. Now this piece is nice and long. It's a nice 3-foot length, so I won't need to use my tongs with it. I'll be able to stick it right into the fire, hold the one end. Once it gets up to temperature, take it out and hammer it. Okay? So now I'm going to unmute the second camera. Just as a warning, it may get a little loud when I hammer. So for those of you who are watching at home, I would recommend turning down your volume, maybe turn it low to the point where you can still hear the hammering, but not get the full effect of the loudness to it. Okay, so I'm going to put my earplugs in, switch over the camera, and get going with my goggles on.
There we go. Unmuted it. There we go. That was okay. All right. going to switch back.
There we go. So I did a very brief demonstration of blacksmithing. I just want to talk a little bit about the process that I followed. So I basically took this piece of steel and stuck it into the fire. Now with my fan on my hairdryer, I turned it up to the highest setting to let it blow in more oxygen into the fire and heat it up even more. It helps transfer heat to my piece of steel even quicker. Once I saw that it got up to a nice bright yellow color, I took it out, took it over to my anvil, and then I started hammering it, smashing it down. So I took my round piece. Hold on, I got another one here. I took my round piece of steel and then I just flattened it out. That's all I did, was just flatten it out. And I can see my mistake. I made it too flat too quick because what I wanted to do was straighten the edges out. And you can do that when you put it onto the anvil and hammer the edges nice and straight. But because I made it too thin too quickly, it made it a little bit harder to straighten those edges out, because as soon as you started to straighten them, it wanted to curl in on itself. But that's fine. It's fine. Learning. This could easily be the beginning of a handle for some sort of flipper. There's all sorts of things you can do with metal. Two main techniques, two basic techniques to practice when you're doing blacksmithing are basically drawing out and upsetting are their names. Drawing out is when you take a piece of metal, hold on. So you take a nice round piece of steel. This is my fire poker that I was using to help manage the fire. It's when you take a nice round piece of steel or square piece of steel and you taper it, make it longer. And that's basically done by hammering the end, heating up, hammering it until it makes it a little bit smaller, thinner, while turning it the whole time. Heat it up some more, hammer it some more, heat it up some more, hammer it some more. And you keep doing that down, down, down until it becomes a point. And that's called drawing out. So I did it to this round bar. Like I said, you can do it to square bar as well too. You can make a round bar square. You can make a square bar round and draw it out. The other term, upsetting. I don't have an example here. Upsetting is when you heat up your metal and you squish it, basically, and you're trying to make it bigger, right? So that can be achieved in a number of ways, depending upon the techniques and methods that you use. You can put the hot metal onto your anvil and hammer the other end if it was nice and flat, and it would upset. It would squish it, make it nice and flat. So yeah, those are the two basic techniques I'd recommend practicing to start off. And with those two techniques, there's, like I said, all sorts of things you can make. One of the first tools I would recommend you making is some sort of poker or something that you can use to manage the fire. I'm going to switch over to the other camera again. I'm going to talk a little bit about managing the fire.
There we go. So half of blacksmithing is managing this thing, your fire. Blacksmiths use coal quite often. Like I said, it could also be an induction heater or a gas heater, but a very popular fuel is coal, just because it's so abundant and everywhere and relatively cheap. Coal, it's a little bit tricky to light your first time. It's something that you can get frustrated with. When I light my fires in my pot here, I use a combination of newspaper and wood. Doing it alone with newspaper is very, very difficult. The wood burns a little bit longer and helps to transfer heat to the coal and get it going. Once you've got the coal lit, what you're trying to do is create this nice little hot pocket. And you can kind of see it in there. I poked it open. You want to create this nice little hot pocket, right? So the outside here is relatively cool, right? I can touch it. It doesn't hurt too much, but inside there, it's hundreds of degrees, hot enough to heat up that metal to the point that we can deform it, all right? So in terms of managing the fire, what happens once you've lit it, you get a little bit of this gray-green smoke you can kind of see with fresh coal, and it burns off the impurities, but then it starts to stick together like this into these big chunks, and that necessarily isn't a good thing. So what you can do is use a poker of some sort to break up the big chunks and also help to feed the fire oxygen. You poke in a hole, make sure oxygen can get in there to keep it going. That has a place for the flames to come on out, and you can basically work it. Another big thing with blacksmithing is managing that little hot pocket that you get in there, right? So sometimes you'll see blacksmiths ladle out some water, and they'll sprinkle it around on their coal, and that's fine. The coal will dry out. Actually, when I am finished with this, whenever I'm finished doing my blacksmithing, I just take my coal and I dump it into a bucket of water to extinguish it relatively quickly. And then you drain out the water, and it's just fine to use the next time. But they will sprinkle water around the coal to help keep certain areas cool and certain areas hot. And that way you can kind of manage the shape of this little hot pocket that you have in there. Sorry, I keep thinking of like the pizza hot pockets that you microwave and then burn the roof of your mouth with. But you manage the hot pocket in there so that you can heat up different shapes. So sometimes, say you wanted on this piece of metal to heat up the middle, you want the hot pocket right in the middle, and you can stick this piece of metal right in the middle, and then the heat transfers to the middle of the metal, and you can work the middle of the metal. But there's other shapes and things that you might want to play with as well too. So keeping that going is a good thing. Now you notice here too, as well, as I'm just talking, the hairdryer is off, and the fire is very quickly cooling down. It doesn't take long. It doesn't take long. Without sufficient oxygen, this thing will smolder out on its own. And I'd say about 15 minutes, it's pretty much done. I actually lit the fire half hour before, and I was talking to a colleague, and the fire almost went out on me. So you just, every once in a while, got to make sure that you give it a little bit more oxygen. So you can see here, it's already smoldering out. So I'm going to give it a little bit more oxygen just to get it going again. I know the air is blowing in from the middle, so I'm just making sure there's a nice path from the middle of my pot for the oxygen to blow out, and we can transfer some of that heat, and I'll warm right back up again. Get right up to working temperature. So every once in a while, you want to break stuff up, poke in there to make sure it's getting to the oxygen, and you're good to go. You can already see it's starting to light up some more. I already got a bit of an orange glow started. So yeah, that's half of blacksmithing right there. It's just playing with your fire, making sure it's going and working well. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, I have an old brake drum that I got for free from a automotive repair place. But lots of other junk can be used for a forge for your pot. Another popular one that I've seen are old lawnmowers. You take the engine off, and the shell of the lawnmower makes a fantastic pot to hold your fire in. Where the engine pokes through is a perfect place to put a hole for your blower, so you can put your hair dryer or an actual blower, an actual fan motor that's dedicated to blowing air in this manner, not just some thrift store find. And you can actually set it up quite nicely with a lawnmower as well too. There we go. Look at that. Nice and fun. It's getting nice and hot there. And that's ready to work again. All right, I'm gonna go back. Say hello to the computer.
There we go. So that's about all I have to say about blacksmithing. There are tons of resources out there. There's lots of fantastic YouTube channels full of guys who kind of do the DIY method, kind of like what I do here, all the way up to professional blacksmiths who do it for a living, and it's very much an art and a way to earn their paycheck. Yeah, so there's tons of YouTube tutorials out there. There's also tons of books. The library has some decent books on blacksmithing available as well too for you to sign out. Goes over all the basics. There's all sorts. I definitely would recommend reading a variety, because again, blacksmithing is one of those things where there's probably 20 different methods to solve any one problem that you have, and it's more a matter of what you're comfortable with or what you find appealing, what you're interested in learning about. So having that variety, looking at a variety of YouTube channels, signing out a variety of books is a fantastic thing, because you'll quickly see that there's 20 different ways to do various things with blacksmithing, and you'll learn very, very quickly what ones you like and what ones you don't like. Let's see, what else? I'll show you my first blacksmithing project. There we go. Bottle opener. So this one was just a nice rectangular chunk of steel. Punched a hole through it. So I used that Pritchell hole that I showed you earlier with a chisel, another tool. So I basically heated up my metal, punched a hole with the chisel. You basically go halfway through on one side, flip it over, go the other half on the other side, and a little slug of metal pops out. It's pretty neat. And then I use what's called a bick. It's a cone that fits into the hardy hole. Put your piece of metal onto that bick, and you hammer it down when you heat it up. And eventually that hole turns into this. You flatten a nice little bit in the middle to catch onto the bottle cap, and you got yourself a bottle opener. Whoop. There you go. You can kind of see it. Working with the camera's hard. Shoot, just like that. This is my first one. Another one that I did is I made my own pair of tongs. So making tools for blacksmithing is a very popular part of blacksmithing. So these were just two pieces of steel twisted in a vise, a hole punched in the middle. And this is actually just a screw that was put in. Hammered the screw in and then riveted the other end. So you just upset the other end. You widen it, and then you got a pair of tongs that will work. Right? There's all sorts of tools you can make also for the hardy hole as well too. So if you want to make your own chisels and things like that, I believe it's axle steel from some trucks is a popular one. You drive it into the hardy hole to make a nice square piece of steel that can plug into the end, and then you shape it to make your chisel. So all sorts of things. And I think it's time to open it up for questions. I think there might be one. Oh, there are no questions according to. I just have a comment saying that this is cool. Thank you to whoever said this is cool. It's quite a bit of fun. So yeah, that's it for me, I guess. If you have any questions, hold on. I'm going to throw up my email address. Boom. I made a banner for that. There we go. If you have any questions about blacksmithing or you're curious and you want to get into it, give me a shout. I always like talking about it. It's quite a bit of fun. Great way to relieve some stress. And a lot of people tend to congregate around when you're doing it because they're very curious as to what you're doing. It's a good way to meet people and have some nice conversations. So yeah, that's it for me. Yeah, no questions. All right. I think I'm going to say goodbye. Bye.